Host Bad Takes with Bad Takes in Football, back with another episode for you. Excited for this live stream. We're going to be going into the Monday Night Football game tonight between the Ravens and the Lions. We'll also be talking about the Sunday slate of games, recapping some upsets, some crazy things that happened, especially from a special teams perspective. Are the Chiefs finally going to get back on a roll after beating the Giants last night? We'll talk about that, plus much more. We'll give everyone a little bit more time to join in. Like I said, we'll make sure everyone can file in. I left a comment in chat. Please let me know, what game were you most excited about yesterday? Again, there was an exciting match. There's a bunch of exciting games that happened, but we'll get into those games plus much more. Like I said, we'll be starting out talking about the Monday Night Football game that happens tonight between the Detroit Lions and the Baltimore Ravens. Obviously a big matchup between an NFC and AFC powerhouse. We'll see what happens. While we're waiting for people to file in, again, I'm on my road to my first 100 subscribers. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. It really does help me out, helps other people find my content, and it also is free for you to do. We will be doing a giveaway. I'm going to be giving away like a portable Bluetooth speaker that comes in one speaker, but you can actually break it into two different speakers. So it's a really cool gift. Again, just hit that subscribe button. I'll be giving that away to one of my first 100 subscribers. Again, also make sure you chat. Tell me what you thought about this week's games. Again, there were some really exciting games that happened, and we'll get into those specifically. Yeah, I do agree with you. The Seahawks do actually look legitimate this year. Mike McDonald, I think, is going to be a great coach. I really thought that from the beginning. He just seemed to be a guy when he was a defensive coordinator for the Baltimore Ravens, just really understood the game of football first off. He absolutely loves it, and he's just super creative. He seems like an out-of-the-box sort of thinker. So for me, I'm really happy that he's a head coach now. Miss him in Baltimore. But really think he's putting together a great team. Sam Darnold isn't necessarily the best quarterback in the NFL. He had a great year last year, and he seems to be more than a manageable quarterback this year, right? They're 2-1. They beat the Steelers, and then they beat the amazing Saints team. Are you saying there's something messed up with my sound? But yeah, no, I really do think the Seahawks are a legitimate team. We'll definitely see what happens with them in the NFC West. The fact that the 49ers keep winning games with Mac Jones is crazy. We'll definitely talk about that game. But again, we'll get started out with the actual Monday Night Football game tonight. Again, between the Detroit Lions and the Baltimore Ravens, that is in Baltimore. So let's just dive right into that. First thing I want to say about this is the Ravens have a lot of crucial players that are actually missing for this game today. More specifically, the player that I think is going to have the biggest impact missing this game is Nnamdi Madubuike, right? The defensive tackle who's leading the Ravens right now in sacks, and he's also a great defensive tackle when it comes to run defense as well. They're also going to be without Kyle Van Noy, who messed up his hamstring last week. He pulled up pretty early in a drive, and that was pretty early on in the game. So they're going to be without Kyle Van Noy, and they haven't yet been able to bring back Isaiah Likely or Patrick Ricard. Patrick Ricard, to me, is sort of the lifeblood of the Baltimore Ravens. Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson are the key features, right? But to me, Patrick Ricard is who really makes this Baltimore offense go. He's sort of a cheat code. It's like having another lineman out there, but really he's in fullback form and can even catch the ball sometimes, from the backfield, which is pretty impressive for a 300-pound fullback. So missing him, Isaiah Likely, he is their key tight end. Mark Andrews, we really haven't seen much of him this year. I'm not sure if he's sort of doing the Travis Kelce route where he doesn't necessarily become that top sort of tight end until the end of the season, right? Maybe saving his legs, because of the fact that he is getting older. Mark Andrews still isn't that old. I think he's 28, 29 years old. But at the same time, these first two games, we really haven't seen much of Mark Andrews. So Isaiah Likely being out really does hurt, the Baltimore Ravens a lot. And on the other side of this, the Detroit Lions are coming in, I think, with a lot of confidence. They're really, really motivated to beat the Bears last week, going up against Ben Johnson. I think that was a really pivotal moment for this Detroit Lions team, just really getting their confidence to say, hey, we can beat Ben Johnson. Our offense does not need him. We have all the pieces here in Detroit without having to need Ben Johnson. So to me, the Lions are coming into Baltimore with a lot of confidence. And the last time that the Detroit Lions and the Baltimore Ravens faced each other, especially in Baltimore, Lamar Jackson and this Ravens team absolutely crushed the Detroit Lions. It wasn't even a game, from the beginning. I think the final score was something along the lines of 35-7, and the Detroit Lions didn't necessarily do anything to make that game seem remotely close. So to me, there's a couple things that I also want to pay attention to. It's can Derrick Henry get back, into the swing of things for this Baltimore Ravens offense? I talked about the fact that there's some crucial players, especially out for the Ravens defense. And so the Ravens offense is going to have to carry the load a lot in this game. Again, the Detroit Lions, they're a very high-powered offense. I expect with Justin Madubuike and, Kyle Van Noy out amongst others, I expect them to run the ball a lot, very early and often with Jahmyr Gibbs, with David Montgomery. And so this Ravens offense, one, they're going to need to be able to control the clock and control the ball, keeping that Detroit Lions offense off the field. And they're also going to need to be able to make sure that they're able to keep up from a scoring perspective with the Detroit Lions in this game. I really do think that the Detroit Lions have the advantage in this game purely from some of these injuries that we've seen. I also trust the Detroit Lions offensive line more than I trust the Baltimore Ravens offensive line. Aiden Hutchinson hasn't necessarily had that breakout game yet, but at the same time, the Ravens pass rush has struggled as well, besides Nnamdi Madubuike, who, like I said, is out with a neck injury. I'll go into that injury a little bit more. To me, it definitely scares me what's happening. They're not saying what happened. There was no particular play where it happened. And they're trying to understand and evaluate the symptoms. The Ravens are always sort of ominous about the injuries. At this point, I would have already expected Isaiah Likely back. They alluded to the fact there was a chance he was going to play week 1, and he's still out. So to me, again, no one really knows when it comes to injuries for the Ravens. But again, Derrick Henry getting back on track is a crucial aspect of the Ravens having a chance to win this game. Derrick Henry, he's had 2 pretty crucial fumbles in the last 2 weeks and basically didn't play much after the first quarter against the Cleveland Browns. The Cleveland Browns, their game plan was, hey, we're going to take Derrick Henry out of this game plan. You're going to have to beat us in the passing game if you want to win this game, Baltimore. So that was very obvious. But at the same time, a lot of teams have tried to do that and haven't been successful. That's not to say, that doesn't happen every week, but the Cleveland Browns were very successful at it. And so you have to wonder, is that the same sort of game plan that the Lions are going to go into this game with? Again, they have a really solid defensive line. They have a really solid linebacking core as well. And even in their secondary, they're a very stacked team, overall. And so they can sort of pick their poison as to what they want to do from shutting down the Ravens sort of perspective. Now, one thing that I think is interesting that I can't not talk about when talking about this matchup and the fact that it is a Monday Night Football game is the fact that Lamar Jackson actually has a 7-2 record on Monday Night Football, especially. That's a crazy record. To me, you just gotta have to wonder, is Lamar Jackson is he better in the spotlight? Is he better in those bigger games? The playoffs tell you otherwise, right? Everyone will tell you the biggest knock on Lamar Jackson is the fact that he can't win a playoff game. But at the same time, these primetime games in the regular season, that seems to be when Lamar Jackson plays his best. And so again, I don't think Lamar Jackson's going to have a tough game in this game. I think Lamar is going to be Lamar. You potentially seeing that MVP caliber sort of playing, but at the same time, again, the Lions, I just really I like this team a lot. They were my NFC pick to make it to the Super Bowl, and at this point, that still hasn't changed. I'm definitely impressed, and I'm constantly watching the Rams and whether or not Matt Stafford's back, starts to become an issue. The Philadelphia Eagles, who I'll talk about more later, they're a really good team. They're not exciting at all to watch. Maybe that's partly why I don't have them being my Super Bowl favorite. Is when I watch that team, it's like watching the Spurs when they had David Robinson and Tim Duncan. Right? They knew how to win games, but it wasn't flashy. It wasn't fun to watch. They were just an overall good team, and they knew how to play together. And when you watch that Eagles team, that's really what I feel like. That's how I see that team being. They're not flashy, they're not exciting, but they get the job done. So again, the Lions to me, I really have them as my Super Bowl favorite. And again, going back to what I expect from the Lions, I think we're going to see a very run heavy game plan. They're similar to what I was saying about the Ravens needing to run to keep the Lions offense off the field. The Lions are going to want to keep Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry off the field. Again, that's probably one of the deadliest backfield duos in the NFL. I think some people might compare it or say that maybe Saquon Barkley and Jalen Hurts is a better duo, and I wouldn't necessarily argue with that. But at the same time, Montgomery and Gibbs are going to have to keep Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry off this field. The other player and this aspect I'm really curious to see is what does this Ravens pass rush do without Van Noy and Madubuike? Mike Green, the second rounder, he's shown flashes. He was getting to Joe Flacco and was able to get him on the ground. I think he recorded a half a sack in the game last week. So you're really going to need to see a big game from Mike Green as well as Odafe Owe. Odafe Owe has been pretty silent for the Ravens this year, and this is a contract year for Odafe. So he's really going to need to start putting up some numbers if he's going to want to see those bigger contracts that these edge rushers have been getting. He was a 10-plus sack guy last year, but he hasn't necessarily been able to finish out, these sacks this year again, and which was an issue he was having in his first 2 years of his career before. So, again, the Ravens pass rush is going to be really important in this game. I really am curious to see how Mike Green plays. I think he's got himself a really tough matchup against the tackles of the Lions. Penei Sewell as well as Taylor Decker are a really good duo. But you're going to have to find ways to beat them and cause havoc for Jared Goff, because Jared Goff, if he's not getting flustered, if he's not having to run out of the pocket, he's just going to sling the ball. He has an amazing completion percentage. He's completing 80% of passes in some of these games. And so if you don't cause problems for him, he's just going to throw the ball all over you if you're a Baltimore Ravens defense. The secondary, they struggled against the Bills, and the Bills don't even have nearly as good of a receiving core that the Detroit Lions have. Jameson Williams, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Isaac Tesla. I love Isaac Tesla. I talked about him last week. I think that guy is such a playmaker. And so again, this is going to be a very high scoring game. I think this is going to be one of the most high scoring games of the season to this point. And so to me, again, if you're the Ravens, Lamar Jackson can't be the only answer. You need to have Derrick Henry be productive and getting really heavy yardage. I'm talking, you need at least 115 yards out of Derrick Henry, in my opinion, for the Ravens to have a good shot to win this game. And on the other side, again, Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, you're going to have to keep Lamar Jackson off this field. And so, I think this would be a high-scoring game, but I actually have the Lions winning this game, and it's going to be 34-30, again, in a very high-scoring game. Again, make sure you're subscribing to this channel. Also, make sure to comment and be active in chat. Tell me what you think about these last week's games. We're going to be diving into an upset next, but again, tell me what you thought about these weeks, this past week's games. Tell me what you think about especially this Packers Browns game. What did you guys think about this Packers Browns game? Because to me, this was the game I don't think anyone expected, but at the same time, and I'll talk about this, it's a perfect trap game situation. All right, so again, let's talk about this Packers versus Browns game. The Packers, they were up through the first three quarters 10-0, which again is not a huge lead. But at the same time, there was nothing that told you that the Browns were going to have any chance in coming back in this game at the same time. But again, any given Sunday, right? That is why they play these games. I know that's like a corny thing to say, but the games are played and not simulated because of the fact that anything can happen in these games. I talked about it very briefly in a video I put out this morning, but this was one of those games where field goals being blocked, right? Special teams are a huge aspect of these games that a lot of people are not talking about. But again, this was the perfect situation for a trap game for the Packers. The Packers are coming off of a huge win against the Commanders. They had, even more time to get ready for this game. And at the same time, and I'm not saying that the Cowboys are like their rival or, this is the Packers version of their Super Bowl. But you can't help but think that Micah Parsons had, next week's game circled on his calendar amongst other players, right? There's probably a lot of players that are saying like, hey, we got to win this game for Micah. Like we need to have a huge game. And you're looking at the Cleveland Browns, and I don't think anyone's intimidated by the Cleveland Browns. You're definitely intimidated by Myles Garrett. But at the same time, the Packers were not looking at this game. And the only thing I can say is like they just didn't take it seriously. That the Packers are, I've talked about the Lions. The Packers are also a top team in the NFC. I think they're one of the best teams in the NFC. I still have the Lions as my Super Bowl favorite just because I'm a huge Dan Campbell guy, and I love what Jared Goff is doing for this Lions offense. But again, the Packers, they have all the talent. No one was really scoring on this Packers team. And I knew this was going to be a low-scoring game. But at the same time, the Packers only being able to put up 10 points against the Browns, that's not something to hang your hat on if you're the Packers. The Ravens put up 41 points on the Browns last week. The Ravens might have a better offense than the Packers, but still at the same time, you had 10 days to get ready for this game, and it was very obvious to me that you just didn't necessarily show up. Like there was nothing on that Packers side of the ball that I was like, oh, that's something to hang your hat on, or like this is the reason why they're going to win this game. They played solid football for the first three quarters, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, you had the Cleveland Browns offense put up 10 points at you at the end. Quinshon Judkins. Let's talk about Quinshon Judkins for a second. Second round pick for the Cleveland Browns. He showed up 2 days before they played the Baltimore Ravens last week and had like over 10 carries in that game. And then in this game, Quinshon Judkins, he had like 92 yards in this game. Yeah, that's and a touchdown, right? He had the only touchdown for the Cleveland Browns in this game. And this is that rookie running back that at one point no one really knew when he was going to be playing. So this is a huge addition for this team. I'm someone, I'll be honest, I drafted Quinshon Judkins in my fantasy draft, and I was really worried about it. But right now I'm starting to feel like I'm a genius because again, he's a solid runner. Like he's a really good running back. Now some other things to kind of pay attention to and why, again, it was 10-0, but the fourth quarter the Browns really turned it on. The Browns had 15 first downs to the Packers 14. Right, that says like, hey, the Browns were actually in certain ways outplayed the Packers. Now the Packers had 230 yards of total offense. The Browns had 221. So they're on a very even playing field from many perspectives in this game, especially on the offensive side. I think one of the biggest differentiators and the reasons why, the Browns were able to come back was, Love was sacked 5 times in this game, right? Jordan Love being sacked 5 times, that is going to cause issues. That's going to make you feel uncomfortable in the pocket. You're going to be looking over your shoulder. And the other aspect of that is the fact that it wasn't always Myles Garrett. I think Myles Garrett had a half a sack in this game. I'm going to pull this up real fast. Yeah, Myles Garrett had a half a sack in this game. Carson Schweissinger had a sack. Malik Collins had a sack in the half. So again, they also had Alex Wright get a sack in this game. So it wasn't just Myles Garrett in this game that was causing problems. And, you look at the Packers offense, rushing wise, they had no success. Josh Jacobs ran the ball 16 times for 30 yards in this game. That's not going to cut it. Josh Jacobs is considered one of the top running backs in the NFL. He's just overly consistent, and he knows also how to score. That's probably one of the biggest things that Josh Jacobs is known for, is getting in the end zone. And he obviously didn't do that today. Now, Matt Golden, the jury's still out for me on the wide receiver Matthew Golden, the first round pick for the Packers. I'm not as much of a believer in him as some are. I think people thought he was going to be a wide receiver 1 for this Packers team immediately, and it's definitely not the case. I also think they missed Jaden Reed. Jaden Reed with that broken collarbone, him being out, I think has a more of an impact on this Packers offense than people realize. Jordan Love really likes connecting with Jaden Reed in the pass game. I've seen that pretty regularly, and I think that ended up hurting them a lot. And Tucker Kraft, he talked a pretty big game. It sounded like he was, last week was his coming out party. He had 25 yards in this game in the passing game. Like, that's just not going to cut it. I know this Browns team, this Browns team is known for their defense. That's really all they can hang their hat on right now, other than the fact that they have an elite quarterback in Joe Flacco. Kidding, but, not kidding at the same time. But again, the Packers losing this game, it's that perfect trap game. Like, I think a lot of people did not expect it, but at the same time, you kind of have to expect it, because you look at their schedule. They had 2 really big games to begin with, and then you play the Cleveland Browns, and then you go play Dallas. And again, I think everyone in that Packers locker room wants to win that game for Micah Parsons especially, and I know Micah is definitely focusing on that game. If you look at his performance in this past game, he didn't have any tackles for a loss. He didn't have a sack in this game. I'm not saying you have to have a sack in every game, but again, this wasn't the Micah Parsons that people expected to see out there. The Cleveland Browns offensive line isn't even that good. They struggle pretty regularly, and so to me, again, this might have been that perfect trap game for the Packers, for them to lose this game. I'm not going to put too much weight into it, besides the fact that it was just, one of those any given Sunday moments for the Packers. I will say congratulations to the Browns, especially the Browns kicker. The Browns kicker, he had some pretty bad things happen to him in week 1, right? He missed some pretty crucial field goals and even an extra point for the Cleveland Browns. But he actually had, a pretty significant field goal, game-winning field goal that was a 55-yarder to win the game at the end of this game, right? That was ultimately the difference. And, I love the fact that Myles Garrett spoke very confidently of him in the press conference. But, again, that's bouncing back for Andre Schmidt. I think that's Schmidt, right? Andre Schmidt, I think is how you say his name. So congratulations to him for hitting that field goal. That's obviously crucial for this Browns team. And, we'll talk even more about special teams real fast. McManus had one of his field goals blocked as well. So it was a 10-10 game at a certain point. And Green Bay had their field goal blocked by the Browns. And that's ultimately what actually set up the game-winning field goal for the Browns, right? They were in a lot better field goal position because they blocked that field goal, and they were able to get down as quickly as possible to set themselves up for a field goal. And again, these blocked field goals, I'll talk more about it when I get into some other games. This special teams is a lot more important than people realize. Like, I don't think people understand how much special teams can make or break a game and make or break a team. You see it very regularly. Like people say it's a game of inches. It's also it's just like a game of detail and execution. And when you have a field goal that's blocked that essentially loses the game for you, you're gonna realize like, hey, like we need to focus more on every aspect of this game, right? It's not just our pass rush. It's not Jordan Love, throwing the ball downfield to Matthew Golden. It's, hey, how do we make sure we don't have a field goal blocked at the end of the game to set the Browns up to beat us? So that's a crucial aspect of this. We'll be going into an AFC South game next. But again, what did you guys think of that Packers-Browns game? Again, was that more so the Packers losing this game, or do you think the Browns won that game? Right? Who had more of an impact on the outcome of that game? Again, make sure you comment in chat. Tell me what you thought about this last week's game. Again, we just went over the Browns and Packers game. Next, we're going to be talking about Colts versus the Titans. And let's just say this, and I'll say this now. I put out a video about these quarterbacks. I'm not considering Daniel Jones necessarily like a journeyman quarterback because this is his second team. But I'm so happy for Daniel Jones and what he's been able to do for this Colts team. I know it's not just him, and we'll talk about Jonathan Taylor as well, but this Colts team is a really good team. I was still kind of having my doubts. They beat the Dolphins, who are 0-3, and then, the Colts came back, and they won last week as well. And let me just pull that up because I'm actually drawing a blank on against who that was. But yeah, it was against the Broncos, right? They beat the Broncos last week. And so going into this game, I was confident that the Colts would win this game because I don't think the Titans are a good team, but I just wasn't sure how good the Colts actually were. And again, this wasn't a game where they just barely inched it out and barely beat the Titans. I mean, they won 41-20. So this was a 3-touchdown win for the Colts. And again, I'm happy for Daniel Jones. Right, Daniel Jones had a great game, but Jonathan Taylor right now is looking like the offensive player of the year so far. If you were to say like who's the MVP of the NFL right now, I'm not picking Jalen Hurts. I'm not picking Justin Herbert. I'm picking Jonathan Taylor. Right, Jonathan Taylor. He's leading the league right now in all-purpose yards. He had 102 yards and 3 touchdowns in this game on 17 carries, including like this one highlight play where he broke a tackle, had a spin move, and ran for like a 46-yard touchdown. Like he's the real deal right now. Jonathan Taylor, he's still young. People, I think, forget about him sometimes because the Colts haven't been super relevant the last couple years. But he's looking and playing like at an MVP caliber level right now. And the Colts have a really good line as well. I think that's a huge reason why Daniel Jones has been able to play at the caliber he has. And the same thing with Jonathan Taylor. Is this Colts offensive line, one, they're moving the line and they're winning in the trenches in the run game, but they're also not giving up a lot of sacks. Daniel Jones is able to sit in that pocket pretty confidently and be able to sling the ball downfield on a regular basis. And, he's had pretty consistent play from his receivers as well. Tyler Warren, I think, is might be his favorite so far. But Michael Pittman is also having a pretty solid season as well. Michael Pittman had 73 yards in this game. And, again, this was a game where Indianapolis went up early, right? It was a 17-3 game in the first quarter, and they just never looked back. On the other side of things, let's talk a little bit about Cam Ward. Because that's really all you need to focus on when it comes to the Tennessee Titans team. I know Josh Simmons is like the guy in Tennessee. He's the leader of that team in a lot of different ways. But Cam Ward, you can't but just feel bad for the guy. Again, his receivers are just they struggle on such a regular basis. and they also they didn't have the run game this week either. Tony Pollard had probably his worst game of the season so far. I know it's only been 3 games, but this was Tony Pollard's worst outing for the Tennessee Titans. And then you look at the receivers, and their top receiver was a tight end in Okonkwo, right? Okonkwo was their top receiver. Ayon Manor was their second. Tyler Lockett. Calvin Ridley had 1 catch for 27 yards. He was targeted 7 times, and he had 1 catch for 27 yards. That's just not going to cut it. And so, again, looking at this Cam Ward, player, I think he's good, right? Again, I'll say this. I think Cam Ward is a solid quarterback, but he's not going to win this Tennessee Titans team any games. Like, it's definitely not this year. Maybe if he improves next year, right? But to me, he's not going to win this Titans team any games. He's going to be able to manage this team, and he'll help them win, but he's not going to be the sole reason. So far, Cam Ward, if you look at his stats, in this game he had 219 yards, he had a touchdown, but he also had an interception. And that interception was very early on as well, which I think had an impact on sort of the momentum of the game and, where this game went. But, Cam Ward so far this season, he has 506 yards through 3 games. He has 2 touchdowns, and he has 1 interception. His QBR is 23.3, which if you actually look at it, and I know there's some injured quarterbacks, so this isn't saying he's like in second to last, but he's ranked 31st right now in the NFL when it comes to QBR. And so I know there's Titans fans that are excited about him. I, for one, think that the Titans should have just gone for the best player available. And in my opinion, it wasn't Cam Ward. I think Cam Ward was the best quarterback in this draft class. Jackson Dart might end up proving that differently. But again, I just don't know if I see Cam Ward bringing success to this Titans team anytime soon. If I'm a Titans fan, if I'm a Titans teammate, what the biggest thing I would be focusing on in this next couple of days, in this next week, next coming weeks, is what can we do to get Cam Ward's confidence up? Again, I think he's putting on a good face. I think he's been a pretty solid leader in the locker room, but you can't help but think this guy is struggling, especially mentally. You're 0-3, and there hasn't been a single game where it seems like you even had a shot. That's a big aspect. This guy, he went to University of Miami. I know that he wasn't there for anything prolifically, but he's used to winning, right? You play for a team like Miami, you're used to winning games. And your first year in the NFL as a starting quarterback and being the first pick in the draft, there's a lot of expectations. And it has to be hard when you start out the season 0-3, and then you have to look at it and say, okay, who do the Titans actually play next? Right? When is the next time they actually have a chance? Because it actually might be next week. Next week they play against the Houston Texans, who is just another terrible AFC South team. We'll talk about them in a little bit because I have no idea what's going on with CJ Stroud. But again, maybe that's the type of game that will give Cam Ward confidence. I will say if Cam Ward and the Titans are able to beat the Texans, that would be one that sound the alarms in Houston. Houston, we have a problem. Legitimately, I would consider that wouldn't be an overreaction. I think that's an 0-3 Houston's Texans team who made the playoffs last year, made the playoffs the last 2 years, and CJ Stroud looked like he was going to be the next sort of top quarterback coming out, young quarterback. He's regressed even more. But again, we'll talk more about that. But again, if I'm the Titans, I'm just focusing on how do we get Cam Ward's confidence up? What do we do to focus on that? Now, another situation, another game that we'll get into, Bengals versus the Vikings, right? Vikings won this game 48-10, so we won't spend too much time on this game because to me, this was just the battle of the backups. What I will say is I'm very happy for Carson Wentz. No, he didn't have some MVP caliber game, but at the same time, he won this game, and he won this game very, very easily with the Minnesota Vikings. On the other side, Jake Browning, who I think a lot of Cincinnati Bengals fans still have a lot of confidence in Jake Browning. He did have 3 interceptions in the game against, the Jacksonville Jaguars where he wasn't expected to get in. But, this past week, he didn't do much better. That's the scary part. And so that's something that I think we really need to pay attention to is, Jake Browning, he threw the ball for 142 yards. He did throw 1 touchdown, but he had 2 interceptions, which means in about 6 quarters of football, he has 5 interceptions. Right? He had 3 last week and he had 2 this week. The Bengals can't run the ball either. That's a huge problem. They're expecting Chase Brown to be, the guy. Chase Brown is he's a solid 3rd down running back. That is where I would put Chase Brown. He is a solid 3rd down running back. He is not a 1st down, 2nd down running back. He just isn't. He can be, but that's not where he's supposed to be, especially in the NFL. Right? In the NFL, there are so many other running backs that have the different skills than Chase Brown. Chase Brown is known for being versatile and being a pretty solid, receiving running back. And so you're now seeing Samaje Perine taking these 1st and 2nd down runs at times, and it's just not enough. When you don't have Joe Burrow out there and you're counting on Jake Browning to just sling the ball to Jamar Chase and T. Higgins all game, you need a run game to help open that up. Because if you're the defense, all you're going to do is focus on T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. That's all you have to do is just shut them down. And, they did a pretty good job of shutting down Jamar Chase throughout the game. I think he caught some catches later on in the game that make his stats seem like he had a better game than what I really saw and paid attention to. He had 5 catches for 50 yards, but through like the first 2 or 3 quarters, he probably had like 17 yards. It was very minimal. T. Higgins 1 catch for 15 yards in this game. The Cincinnati Bengals are in trouble, right? And again, I'm happy for Carson Wentz. Carson Wentz threw for 173 yards. He had 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. He didn't make mistakes, and that's the biggest aspect. I think I said that going into this game. It's which quarterback doesn't make the most amount of mistakes, who doesn't turn the ball over, and that's what you're going to see win this game. I will also say Jordan Mason is doing a great job of being the RB1 for Minnesota. Aaron Jones being out, I thought was going to be a bigger hit for this Minnesota Vikings team. Not having J.J. McCarthy and Aaron Jones, I was like, that's just a lot of change. It made me scared, and I thought the Bengals actually had a really good shot of winning this game, especially even without Joe Burrow. But Jordan Mason had 116 yards and 2 touchdowns in this game. He was averaging 7.3 yards a carry. He had 16 carries for 116 yards. That is top level running right there. Like you have to be very happy about those numbers if you're the Vikings and if you're Jordan Mason. Now, again, if I'm the Bengals, you're 2-1. This was your first full game without Joe Burrow. What is this the beginning of the end for the Bengals, or is this just like a bump in the road? That's my biggest question going into next week for Cincinnati, and to see how they respond. Was that a big bump is this the end of their season? Is Jake Browning not going to have the Jake Browning 2023 season that he had? Because they play against the Broncos, then they play against the Lions, and then they play against the Packers, the Steelers, the Jets, right? They're playing against top defenses. There's just a huge mismatch in all of these games. The Broncos offense, I'm not going to say is like this amazing, prolific offense, but if you compare the Broncos defense to the Cincinnati Bengals defense, it's night and day different. The Broncos defense is so much better than the Bengals defense. And on the flip side of things, I think at this point, without a Joe Burrow, the Broncos have a huge advantage over the Bengals. So again, I'm really curious to see if Jake Browning is able to bounce back for the Bengals. That's going to be a huge tell for me in what happens, with this Bengals team. I'm not going to sit here and say that this is the end of the road for the Bengals, because they still have time to figure things out with Jake Browning, but they're going to have to figure it out fast because, again, they have a really tough schedule coming up. Let's talk about the Steelers versus the Patriots. The Steelers won this game 21-14, and Really, all that came down to, and the reason why the Patriots lost this game was because of turnovers. The Patriots turned the ball over 5 times in this game. 5 times. And a lot of times they were in scoring position when they did it. The Steelers' offense is not good. That's another thing. Like Aaron Rodgers, he had a really solid first game against the Jets. A lot of times I felt like it was gimmicky plays that worked, or misdirections, or sort of just misassignments from the Jets defense. But this Steelers offense just, to me, is just not good. I just do not see this Steelers offense being able to maintain what they need to do in order to win games throughout the rest of the season. I will say the Steelers defense, they had a great game. Again, they caused a lot of those turnovers. There was a lot of fumbles. But if you actually look at this, the Patriots outplayed the Steelers in every other facet of this game. The Steelers had 49 plays on offense. The Patriots had 71. That's such a huge disparity. The Patriots had 369 yards in this game to 203 of total offense for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Right? If you're the Steelers, you're happy you won this game, and that's it. You're not looking at this team and saying, this is a squad right here. We have a really good team right here. They're 2-1, right? So technically right now they're tied for first place with the Cincinnati Bengals. But again, you have your concerns if you're the Steelers right now, because Aaron Rodgers, to me, just doesn't seem to be it. He's only going to be getting more bumped up, more bruised throughout this season. You're playing in the AFC North. You have a tough schedule. This is not going to be an easy road for the Steelers. Their defense is going to have to play at an elite level for them to be able to maintain this. I'm just being completely honest, because I just don't see this offense being able to do everything. I know Jalen Warren seems to be a guy people really like, but to me, he's just not enough. You need to see more, especially out of DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf is someone that I'm not impressed with at all right now. But yeah, Jalen Warren. Jalen Warren had 18 carries for 47 yards in this game. That's not going to cut it. He had 5 catches for 34 yards. He was the second leading receiver in this game. Calvin Austin had 3 catches for 34 yards and a touchdown in this game. That was their top receiver. DK Metcalf had 3 catches for 32 yards. This Steelers offense is not good. They invested so much into this team, and all you got was mediocrity, in my opinion. It just the Patriots are just not a good team right now. That's really what it comes down to. I'll talk more about the Patriots. I thought Mike Vrabel was going to be able to turn things around pretty quickly with the Patriots, and generally I'm pretty pleased with what I've seen out of Drake May. The fumbles have to go, though. The turnovers overall have to go. But the Patriots just aren't a good team right now. They don't have the offensive weapons. Their run game is terrible. Their run game is absolutely abysmal right now. I don't understand what happened to Travion Henderson. I expected so much more out of Travion Henderson this season. I thought he was going to be a game breaker for this Patriots team, and he had 11 carries for 28 yards in this game. 11 carries for 28 yards. Ramondre Stevenson, 4 carries for 18 yards. Drake May was the leading rusher in this game for the Patriots. Drake May had 7 carries for 45 yards. That's just not going to cut it if you're the Patriots, right? They're 1-2. They had a really solid win against the Dolphins last week. Who the Dolphins are 0-3, so you kind of have to look at that with a grain of salt, especially at this point. I know they had a tough loss against the Bills this week, but again, the Patriots just aren't there yet. And again, the Steelers won this game because of 5 turnovers, and they, I'll credit their defense for causing them. But at the same time, I think a lot of those mistakes come down to the Patriots as well. So, I look at this game and I say, this is just not – these teams are just not good. These two teams I would put mid-tier, right? Both teams I would say are mid-tier. Now, let's talk about a really exciting game, and I think, a game that could potentially be what the NFC Championship looks like. I'm talking about the Los Angeles Rams versus the Philadelphia Eagles. So I'm going to take a quick drink while I'm drinking. comment in chat. What did you think about this Rams Eagles game? Are the Eagles really that good, or did the Rams give this game away? That's the biggest question for me. Because again, diving into this game, the Rams owned the Eagles that entire first half. I'll say that from the beginning. My prediction were the Rams were going to win this game, so maybe this is just partly me just wishing I was right. But the Rams, they dominated that first half, and my biggest concern was the fact that I just didn't think the Eagles could get their offense up and running because they've been running essentially a JV offense the first 2 weeks of the season. It was essentially just, hey, run the ball with Saquon Barkley and then do the tush push. That was basically the Eagles offense the first 2 weeks. They won. I'm not going to hate on it too much. But at the same time, that's not what you need to do to win games. And, luckily for, the Eagles, Jalen Hurts, remember the fact that he has A.J. Brown on his team. Because if A.J. Brown didn't have the game that he had, there's zero shot that the Eagles would have won this game at all. There's another big aspect of this game, and, I'll talk about it. It's the fact that, the Rams just couldn't figure out how to block for their field goal kicker. The Rams had a chance to go up by 8 and essentially make it really tough for the Eagles to win that game. They would have had to get a touchdown and a 2-point conversion to tie. And they go down there, and there's like 3 minutes on the clock. And at first I'll say this, I thought the field goal kicker kicked the ball like three feet off the ground. Right? I truly did. The field goal kicker, and I'm trying to remember his name. I apologize. I can't remember his name. But again, it looked like he was kicking the ball. Josh Hardy, sorry, his name is Josh Hardy. Josh Hardy looked like he was kicking the ball like 3 feet off the ground. Like I didn't even think the Eagles blocked his kick. I thought it just hit an offensive lineman. Like that's how low the ball looked. And the kicker, when he looked at it, it didn't even look like he was expecting it to get over top of the offensive line. He just like sat there or stood there and was just like, oh, I kicked the ball, look. But again, that was the biggest deciding factor, was actually special teams in this game. The Eagles blocked 2 field goals. One to actually give them the opportunity to go up in this game, right? Because I'll give credit again to the Eagles offense. They did bring the ball down the field, and they had a game-winning touchdown. But at the same time, the Rams were able to get the ball back. They're down by 1 at this point, and the Rams had a chance to kick another game-winning field goal, and Jordan Davis blocked that one and ran it back for a touchdown. He didn't even need to. It was going to be game over at that point anyway, but he still ran it back for a touchdown. And so it went from being 26-27 to 33-26. And again, all of that comes down to the fact that Rams special teams that just couldn't execute. Like, you couldn't block for your field goal kicker. Like, that game would have been a Rams victory in Philadelphia if you just blocked for your field goal kicker. It's that simple. I mean, I will say also, the Eagles had 4 unanswered touchdowns in the fourth quarter. Like, again, Jalen Hurts, I'll give him his credit. He turned on that offense at the end of this game. But like going into that fourth quarter, they really weren't doing anything. And so, the third quarter. Going into that third quarter, they weren't really doing anything. But again, he was able to turn it on. Jalen Hurts ended up with 226 yards passing. Saquon Barkley only had 46 yards rushing. Right? Again, the Rams really shut down the rush game for the Eagles. And so Jalen Hurts had to do it with his arms. And again, he wasn't doing it in the beginning of this game. So I'm curious to see how the Rams are able to bounce back from this one. Devontae Adams, to me, there were some times he dropped some crucial balls, and so you really have to take a look at that. But I do love this Rams defense. I will say that this Rams defense is really good in my opinion. They're one of the tops in the NFL without a doubt, is this Rams defense. But again, I'm happy with the fact that the Eagles were able to figure out that they do have A.J. Brown on their team. A.J. Brown had 6 catches, a touchdown, and 109 yards. So congratulations to Jalen Hurts reminding himself that A.J. Brown is out there. But the other aspect is you have to be impressed with the fact that the Eagles did win this game, and that's with Saquon Barkley only having 46 yards on the ground. I don't think if you were to tell me before this game started that Saquon Barkley would have 46 yards, I would have told you the Rams would have won by 20. Legitimately, like that's really where I would have thought this game would have been with that amount of yards. Let's dive into the Jets and the Buccaneers. So I think the biggest story in this game is Baker Mayfield just on his revenge tour, right? Steve Wilks, the defensive coordinator for the Jets, he was the guy that actually cut Baker Mayfield in Carolina. And Baker Mayfield said it at the end of this game. He's like, it was personal. It was personal. The other aspect of this game that I'll say is the fact that, again, special teams, huge factor in this game. The Jets had zero shot in this game. They scored a touchdown. The Bucs were about to kick a field goal. And, again, the Jets actually blocked a field goal and ran it back for a touchdown. So this game went from 26 to 13 to 27 to 26, like in a blink of an eye, right? So they scored a touchdown and then they blocked a field goal and ran it back for a touchdown. The Jets did, and that completely changed this game. So again, special teams, just in a blink of an eye, was able to have that much of an impact on this game. Now, the other side of this is the fact that Baker Mayfield just, his third game-winning drive of the season, right? He's 3-0 from that perspective. And the Bucs kicking a field goal to win it, right? So they actually sealed the game, making it 29-27 with a field goal at the end of this game. But, I think this Bucs team is really good. The NFC is so much better, I think, than people realize. I'll say that right now. Like, I'm going through these games. I'm impressed with the Rams. I'm impressed with the Eagles. I'm impressed with the Lions, the Packers. And then you also have teams like the Buccaneers. Like, I think people forget how good the Buccaneers are just because they're in the NFC South, which to me is probably one of the worst divisions in the NFL. They're not even really, it's not even like they're facing those teams, though. They're just winning all their games. Like, I think Baker Mayfield has a shot at competing for the MVP this year. Emeka Egbuka is the number one receiver out of that draft class. There's no doubt in my mind about that. I will say that Emeka Egbuka is just so talented. I would love for the Ravens to have Emeka Egbuka because that guy just he makes play after play after play, and he's playing with like an injured groin at the same time. This is a rookie that's just out there making play after play for this Buccaneers team, and it's so fun to watch. So comment in chat, tell me where would you put the Buccaneers ranking in the NFC right now? Like, where would you actually have them? Because again, like it's a really crowded top. It truly is for me in this NFC team. I haven't even talked about the 49ers. The 49ers are 3-0. I think they're the worst 3-0 team in my opinion, and I'll talk more about that later. But again, like this Buccaneers team, like they are the real deal. Like I'm super impressed with the Buccaneers. Let's go into this Raiders-Commanders game. So the Commanders won this game 41-24, and I'll say this from the beginning: the Commanders controlled this game right off the bat, and you have to again, they had a backup quarterback in Marcus Mariota. He is a true veteran, he is a true professional, but you have to give credit to the Commanders for winning this game with Marcus Mariota. Geno Smith still had a pretty solid game. But to me, it was the rush game for the Commanders. The Commanders had 201 rushing yards to the Raiders 93. Ashton Genty saw the most carries he'd seen all season. He had 16 carries for 62 yards. I said this before, and I'll say this again about Ashton Genty. I think he's a good running back. But to me, he was not worth the draft pick that the Raiders got him at. And I'm just being completely honest from that perspective. Because to me, I've said this before, he's good at a lot of things, but he is not great at anything. Truck sticking, sure. If you want to say he's great at truck sticking people, sure. Like I'll concede that fact, but that is not what makes a good running back a good running back. Like that is not going to win you games. That's not going to be the make or break thing between getting a gold jacket and not. right? Mike Allstott, ask him, right? Like that's who you're comparing yourself to if you're talking about like, oh, this guy's great at breaking tackles with a truck stick. Like, cool. That's not going to win you games, and it's obvious for the Raiders right now because to me, Geno Smith is still carrying this offense. Geno Smith had 289 yards and 3 touchdowns in this game. They still lost. Again, it was 41-24, but he's not getting much help from Ashton Genty. Like if I am the Raiders, I am not happy with how they're utilizing Ashton Genty, and I'm also not happy with the fact that they drafted Ashton Genty so early. There's so many other running backs that could be putting up the same performance, in my opinion, and you wouldn't have wasted that draft capital. You could have gotten a defender, you could have gotten an offensive lineman. There's so many crucial positions they could have spent that draft pick at than at a running back if you're the Las Vegas Raiders. Maybe Ashton Genty proves me wrong, but again, I am not someone that is going to sit here and say like Ashton Genty is the guy because I've seen pretty much the opposite of that. I think he'll be a serviceable, solid running back in the NFL, but he's just not it for me, and we haven't seen him prove any of that yet. Another thing I'll say is I'm really curious to see what's going on with Washington when it comes to Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel to me just hasn't been nearly as involved, hasn't been nearly as impactful as I expected him to be when he came to Washington. He's a very much a Swiss Army knife sort of player. He can beat you in the run game. He can beat you in the pass game. He can beat you blocking. Like he can do so many different things, and he's just such a different style wide receiver. But he's not doing what I think the Commanders brought him into Washington to do. He just doesn't seem to have fit into his groove yet with this Commanders offense. And, having Marcus Mariota out there, maybe that had some of what it had to do with it. But at the same time, you have Terry McLaurin on the other side. Terry McLaurin, he had 78 yards in this game. And again, like I felt like that was going to open up so much more for Deebo Samuel. And it's just, again, he just hasn't found his groove yet. So I'm really curious to see what happens with the with the Commanders when it comes to Deebo, because like I really did think Deebo was going to have more of an impact on this game. Next, we're going to talk about the Falcons and the Panthers, right? That's interesting game to say the least, and so we'll talk about that in a second. So first things first, when it comes to this Falcons versus Panthers game, the Panthers won this game. They won this game 30-0, and all I can really say is the Falcons didn't show up in Charlotte at all. This was a weird game also. I do need to say that. Like, this was a really weird game because you look at this score 30-0, and you would think that Bryce Young threw for like 300 yards in this game, but that wasn't even close to being the case. Bryce Young in this game, I'll pull up the stats. I think he had something like 121 passing yards. Maybe I'm completely off. Yeah, Bryce Young threw for 121 yards in this game. Chuba Hubbard, their leading rusher, had 73 yards. Like, this wasn't a game where the Panthers were just running all up and down the field. Really what it came down to is the fact that Michael Penix is not that good of a quarterback yet. I'm not saying that he won't be, but Michael Penix has a lot of work to do. Like, the Panthers defense is not good. That is a struggling defense. And Michael Penix had 172 yards passing, but he had 2 interceptions. And I was watching this game, and those interceptions, it wasn't something where I was like, oh, I could understand why he threw that ball. It was just young mistakes. Now, Bijan Robinson, he actually probably had his lightest game on the ground. He only had 13 carries for 72 yards. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that the Panthers were up early in this game, and obviously maintained that lead throughout, because again, the Falcons just couldn't score. They couldn't bring the ball down the field. Drake London had 55 yards in the air. That was their top, receiver, followed by Darnell Mooney. I think we're still waiting for this coming out party for Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts through 3 games has 15 catches for 135 yards and no touchdowns. So I'm still waiting for this Kyle Pitts coming out party that Michael Penix promised us. He said he's going to be throwing the ball to him all the time, but it just doesn't seem to be the case. I think the NFC South, it's a one horse race. It's literally the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and then the rest of the teams are just not good. I mean, the Panthers, they're 1-2. Like, I'm happy they won this game. I live in Charlotte, so it's just absolutely miserable in this city when when they're really bad. But again, like, I wouldn't say this was like an amazing performance by any means from the Panthers team. It was just a really weird game. Again, it was 30-0, but it didn't feel that way from a statistical perspective or when you were watching it. Because again, the Panthers weren't like moving the ball down the field. It was just turnovers and taking advantage of field position. Let's talk about the Texans real fast. And we'll talk about Texans Jaguars. The Jaguars won yesterday against the Texans 17-10. And here's what I'll say is I think it's time to hit the panic button in Houston. I really do. I thought CJ Stroud was going to have this turnaround season. I don't know if it's all his fault because, again, they play musical chairs with their offensive line. But I'm watching CJ Stroud, and he's just not – he doesn't look confident out there. He doesn't look good out there. He had 240 passing yards. He had 1 touchdown, and he had 2 interceptions in this game. Again, everyone talked about his sophomore slump year and thought he was going to be able to turn it around, like he was going to be a top guy. He's just – when I watch CJ Stroud – I'm trying to think of the player he gives me the vibe of. It's not Deshaun Watson because Deshaun Watson was actually better. It's like I don't know, like I don't know who to compare him to, but like again, he's just not playing well right now. Like this Texans team does not look like they have the confidence they should have. I thought that they were going to own this NFC South, but again, it's the Colts division to lose. The Colts look so much better than the Texans right now. Now on the other side, I'll talk about the Jaguars. I'm happy for the fact that they won this game. Travis Etienne continues to prove that they should have kept him. When they did. Travis Etienne. He had I think something along the lines of like 75 yards rushing in this game. Let me pull this up real fast. I think it was something like that. Yeah, no, sorry. He only had 56 yards rushing in this game. And Trevor Lawrence still not proving himself. He had 222 yards and an interception in this game. So nothing to write home about, right? So this Jaguars team is not good, but this Texans team is even worse. I thought Nick Chubb was going to be a huge addition for this Texans team, but he just isn't getting the carries he needs in order to be effective. He had 9 carries for 38 yards in this game. And that just doesn't seem like they know, like it doesn't seem like they trust anyone to run the ball. CJ Stroud, again, this was a close game. CJ Stroud had 38 passing attempts in this game. He completed 25 of those, so it wasn't like it was like a terrible completion percentage. But at the same time, it was only for 204 yards, and he had 2 interceptions in this game. Like I don't know what to make of this Texans team, and I can't put my finger on quite what the issue is. I think for me the biggest issue is their offensive line, but I also just don't think that I just don't think CJ Stroud is performing at a high enough level. I think that's honestly the biggest story for the Texans is how poorly CJ Stroud is playing. Now, let's get into this Broncos and Chargers game. This was a really exciting game. I think this might have been actually the best game of the week was the Broncos versus the Chargers. And the Chargers won this game 23-20. And I will say I was 1 point off in my prediction with this game. I had the Chargers winning this game 24-20. So I was 1 point off. I do apologize about that. I hope you all forgive me. But this was a great divisional matchup. First off, I'll say this. Bo Nix had a great game. Bo Nix, I said this before the game. I hadn't seen him really perform at a high level in a key matchup in a game where he is projected to lose. I hadn't seen a game where I thought oh wow, this guy can really compete with the best of them. But he had a really solid game in this game. I will say that they definitely came into this game prepared. He didn't blow me out of the water with his numbers, but at the same time, he just wasn't making mistakes. He had 153 yards and a touchdown in this game. And then J.K. Dobbins, I'm so happy for J.K. Dobbins. That's actually probably the biggest story coming out of Denver for me right now is the fact that J.K. Dobbins might be revitalizing his career. He had 83 yards on the ground and a touchdown, and then he also was effective in. They're missing something, but he also has been effective in the passing game as well. Cortland Sutton, he needed to have the type of game he had in order for the Broncos to keep this game close. He had 118 yards and a touchdown in this game. So he was essentially the entire passing game for the Broncos. And so that's the other reason why I'm impressed with how, Bo Nix performed, because again, there just wasn't a lot of options for him. The next leading receiver was R.J. Harvey, and R.J. Harvey had 14 yards. And so I've talked about this before. The Chargers receiving core, I'm a huge fan of this receiving core. I think Quentin Johnson has really turned the page for this Chargers team, especially. I want to hear from all the Quentin Johnson haters, all the Quentin Johnson doubters, that said he's just, he doesn't have hands. This guy is just making crucial play after crucial play now. He was their leading receiver. He had 89 yards on 6 catches in this game. He outperformed Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen had 65 yards. Ladd McConkey, I'd say, is having the slower start. He's having a slower start than I expected, but I think they're also really focusing on him. He had 41 yards in this game. But this Chargers team, I would put them at the top right now of the AFC. I really do think they might be the best team in the AFC right now. I would actually probably put them over the Bills in that perspective. I think it would go Chargers, Bills, and then I'd probably put the Ravens at third. But this Chargers team is the real deal. They just have a very young offense. They have a really young defense as well, and they just seem to have I think Jim Harbaugh has created a great culture. I think that's the best way to put it. Is Jim Harbaugh has put this team together and put them together in a way that they have a really good chance to succeed, and they're having fun out there. Justin Herbert looks like a completely different quarterback than he has his prior years. He's always put up big numbers, but in big situations he didn't show up. And you're seeing this game after game where he's doing everything he has to do to win these games. And that's why the Chargers are 3-0 right now. The Broncos, they're 1-2. And they're probably one of the better 1-2 teams in this league right now. That's not the Broncos aren't an easy win. And so again, if you're the Chargers, you have to be happy with what you saw out there. I also think if you're the Broncos, you can't go into this game and be too upset, right? Again, you put up 20 points against a really solid Chargers defense, and you're obviously still figuring things out. And so for me, I thought this was one of the more exciting games to watch this week. And, again, going along the same theme with special teams as well, the Chargers won this game at the end of the game with a field goal as well, right? That seems to be a pretty common theme. The special teams were the biggest differentiators so far this week. So, I thought this was a great game. I'm really curious to see what this matchup, the rematch looks like, later on in the season between these two teams. But again, I think the Chargers right now are playing the best team in the AFC right now. We won't go into this next game for too long. Sorry, Ashton, I apologize. But next game we're going to talk about is the Saints versus the Seahawks. Now, the Seahawks won this game 44-13. And this was one of those games where it was 21-0 in a blink of an eye. I was watching different games, and I was waiting to turn this game on, and I turned it on, and it said 21-0, and I thought it was a joke. I truly did. I was like, what happened? How are they already up 21-0? And it wasn't even because of turnovers either. It was a punt return for a touchdown, and then it was just field position. And the Saints or the Seahawks taking advantage of field goal position. So again, the Seahawks were up in this game 21-0, and there was just no chance for the Saints to come back. The Seahawks they did what they needed to do to make it so that the Saints could not come back from that. And that's really all it came down to is this, the Seahawks special teams and their offense like working in tandem to put points on the board. And then the Seahawks defense not giving up any big plays. I will say this for the Saints side, like Spencer Rattler, he's not doing anything to make you lose these games. He actually looks okay out there. He looks serviceable. He's definitely not the answer, but he's also not the reason why the Saints are losing this game. Like the Saints, they're weak at every position. There's not a single aspect of their game besides potentially their offensive line that is like a high caliber position group. It truly not. Alvin Kamara, I love Alvin Kamara, but I just don't think he has it anymore. The receivers are, Brandon Cooks, who it's amazing to me that he is still in the league somehow. Like I think he's a solid receiver, but I every year I forget Brandon Cooks exists, and then every year he'll have some random, 90-yard bomb for a touchdown catch, in a game. But again, Brandon Cooks, he's not the answer. Rashid Shaheed, you're a solid wide receiver 3 on most teams, and then Chris Olave. Ashton, you said this, but Chris Olave, he's not a wide receiver 1. 1, he can't stay healthy, and 2, he's just not a big enough or dominant enough receiver to be a wide receiver 1. I would say he's like a lesser version of like a Garrett Wilson. That's really where I would put him is he would be a good wide receiver 2 on any team, including the Saints, but he is not a wide receiver 1 type of player. Let's talk about this Cowboys versus Bears game. So first thing I'll say is Ben Johnson put together quite the game plan, right? I think Caleb Williams, he executed at a very high level. Caleb Williams, he had the game he needed to have in order to gain some confidence and gain some momentum and also get the Chicago fan base and the media off of his back a little bit. Caleb Williams was probably more under fire than Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce have been this season so far. There's been more attention put on him than anyone else, in my opinion. But he had 298 yards passing and 4 touchdowns. And again, this was the type of game that he really needed. And I also will say, I did call this game. I did think that the Cowboys were going to lose this game because similar to what happened to the Packers, I thought that the Cowboys had this next week's game circled on their calendar. I thought they were going to be focusing on their matchup against the Packers and going up against, Micah Parsons. But again, the Bears just seem to have the game plan necessary to win this game. There was a flea flicker play. There's, some other, sort of trick plays. CeeDee Lamb going out was also a huge impact on this Cowboys team. CeeDee Lamb, he is the Cowboys offense still, right? George Pickens, he's a solid pickup. George Pickens had, a touchdown in this game, but he also had a crucial drop. And I think, one of those turned into one of Dak's 2 interceptions. But again, you have to have CeeDee Lamb out there for this Cowboys offense to be what it's supposed to be. George Pickens, again, he's just not a wide receiver 1 yet. He might turn into one, but he's nowhere close to the caliber of player that CeeDee Lamb is at. And so I think that's the biggest thing is, again, the Bears just out game planned and out executed. And I felt like Dallas really showed their stripes in the sense that I just don't think they're nearly the caliber of team that they need to be in order to win games week in, week out. I think this Cowboys team, especially without Micah Parsons, you're going to see a team that's going to be closer to, right below 500 in my opinion. We got 2 more games to go, and then we'll sign off. But we'll quickly touch on the Cardinals and the 49ers game. And again, I talked a little bit about this, but this game was just back and forth with very minimal scoring. First off, like it was one of those games where like each team would have an okay drive, but then it would just get halted for one reason or the other. A biggest aspect I do need to talk about is Nick Bosa going to be okay? They were worried about his ACL. From what I understand, they think that he avoided a major ACL injury, but they still had to reevaluate things. And I think that'll come out more today as well, as what's really happening with Nick Bosa's knee, because again, they cannot afford another injury. Like, this team just has so many injuries. I will say, on the other side of that, happy for Mac Jones. Mac Jones has his second win of the season so far. And again, this is a divisional game. The Cardinals were 2-0, so were the 49ers. And so the 49ers winning this game, like, that is going to have playoff implications, even without Brock Purdy and George Kittle, right? Brandon Ayuk as well. And, you look at this game, it wasn't something where, like, this was the Christian McCaffrey show. McCaffrey had 17 carries for 52 yards. Like, Christian McCaffrey was not the reason why the 49ers won this game. The 49ers won this game because of game planning and execution. I remember seeing a huge stop by Fred Warner on a fourth down play, and on a third down conversion, and you just saw him just begging the Cardinals, like, yeah, run a fourth down play, like, don't punt the ball. And that's the type of, leadership this 49ers team needs, and the culture that they have. I'll be the first to say I doubted the 49ers going into the season. I just thought there was too many injuries. I think they're just getting too old. But they're finding ways to win. And it's similar to, like, the Eagles in that sense. Like, you just can't doubt these good organizations, these well-run, good culture organizations. And maybe that's my biggest lesson going into this, is they just continuously find ways to win these games. Again, very similar to the Eagles, because it's just, they're not winning in a sexy way. They're not blowing teams out of the water, but they're still finding ways to win. Like I said, Mac Jones, he had like 285 yards passing in this game. He had a touchdown and an interception, right? So he did make a mistake, but again, they still won this game at the end of the day. And in my opinion, he outperformed Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray had been playing pretty well up until yesterday, but again, huge win for the 49ers. I'm also really sorry for James Conner. From what I understand, I think James Conner might have had a season-ending injury. I can't remember if it was an ankle or a knee. Someone put in chat if you remember which one it was, but that's a huge loss for the Cardinals if James Conner isn't able to play for the rest of the season, because he's a huge aspect of this team. Also, I'm still waiting for Marvin Harrison to be the guy that everyone thought he was going to be. Kyler Murray can launch the ball down the field, but I'm watching Marvin Harrison, and I just don't see a guy that looks like he is a top receiver or a top caliber type of receiver by any means. There was so much hype going into this season about him. He'd gained a bunch of muscle. He had bulked up. He was going to be a dominant wide receiver one, and we're just not seeing that yet. So the jury's out for me on what this Cardinals team actually is. They are 2-1, like I said. And the NFC West seems to be pretty deep from that perspective. The Seahawks are also 2-1. So we'll see what happens. You have the Rams, the Seahawks, the 49ers. This NFC West might be the most exciting division, potentially, when it comes to the playoff race. So, again, we will see. I do see Seattle still as the top team in this division. But, again, kudos to the 49ers. And, happy for the fact that they were able to, again, get down the field for a last-minute field goal, like game-winning field goal drive. Again, special teams ended up being the difference in this game as well. But happy for the 49ers, and we'll see what happens with the Cardinals without James Conner. Next game we're going to talk about, the last game we're going to talk about, the Chiefs versus the Giants. The Chiefs won this game 22-9, and I think the biggest story is just Russell Wilson in this game. Russell Wilson, he looked a lot more like week 1 Russell Wilson, not week 2 Russell Wilson, where he had 450 yards against the Cowboys. I understand what the Giants are trying to do by keeping Jackson Dart out of the starting position for quarterbacks for the New York Giants, right? They don't want to put the pressure on him. I think they think they don't have the team in order to make him be a successful quarterback yet. Maybe it's because of the fact that they just know that the Commanders and the Eagles are that much better, so there's just not a point in rushing him into it quite yet. But when when Russell Wilson has basically a 50% completion percentage for 160 yards and he has 2 interceptions, and both of those interceptions were in crucial points in the game when the Giants still had a really good shot at winning this game, you just have to wonder, like, why? Right? Well, like, why do you continuously do this? Like to me, it's okay if you put Jackson Dart in and he doesn't succeed. If you also like put it out there, like, hey, we're just giving him reps, right? We're not putting Jackson Dart out there to be, the season winning, like season saving guy for them, right? Because again, there is young talent on this Giants team. Like that pass rush, like Brian Burns, Abdul Carter, Kayvon Thibodeau, I will say they didn't have the performance I expected or had hoped from them. It seems to me Brian Burns is the guy right now for this Giants team. Like, one of the biggest plays was actually a play where, and this was when I was like, okay, maybe he is not who I thought he was going to be. Like, Abdul Carter had an opportunity to chase down Patrick Mahomes. And Patrick Mahomes, he can run, but he is not a fast quarterback by any means. Like, no one looks at Patrick Mahomes and says, "Oh, that's a speedy like quarterback." He knows how to scramble, and he's really smart with how he runs. But at the same time, Abdul Carter runs like a 4.3, 4.4 40, and Patrick Mahomes made him miss and extended the play enough to actually give the Chiefs a field goal at the end of the first half. That, again, I'm not saying that was the deciding factor in this game. The deciding factor was the mistakes that Russell Wilson made, in my opinion. But again, they're just not making the plays that I expected them to make yet. That might be one of my worst takes so far this year. I thought that the Giants pass rush was going to be the best in the NFL. I'll say that right now. That was hand up. I was wrong. This Giants pass rush is struggling at this point. And on the other side of things, it seems to me like it's still just Patrick. It's Patrick Mahomes or bust in this game. Tyquan Thornton, he had a really big game. I'm happy for Tyquan Thornton, but Juju Smith-Schuster, Hollywood Brown are not the answers. Travis Kelce, 4 catches for 26 yards. Again, Travis Kelce, he's older at this point. He just, I think, saves his legs for the end of the season. He is not having nearly the sort of year that they need him to have right now, in my opinion, for them to be a competitive team. They do get Rashee Rice back in practice now, but at the same time, I'm also worried about their running game. This was the best game for Pacheco. He had 10 carries for 45 yards. But they just don't have a run game. Their run game previously, like their leading rusher this season, and it still might actually be the case, is actually Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes is the leading rusher for Seattle, or for the Chiefs, and he still is. Patrick Mahomes leads the team with rushing for 125 yards on the season right now. So in 3 games, he has 125 yards. Pacheco has 92 yards in 3 games. That's a little bit above a 30-yard average per game. That's not going to cut it. On the bright news for the Chiefs, what I will say is your defense is actually this team. Patrick Mahomes has been keeping them in games and has helped them win against the Giants. But really, the story of this Chiefs team is this defense. Chris Jones, he's having a great year. I think Nick Bolton is a crucial player for this team. Trent McDuffie did a great job of shutting down Malik Neighbors. I know it was sort of a group. It was sort of defensive. It was like at times like 3 defenders on Malik Neighbors, but Trent McDuffie was like the key guy in this. So again, if you're the Chiefs, you got to be happy with your defense. Still have a lot of concerns about the offensive side. We'll see what happens with Xavier Worthy coming back and Rashee Rice coming back probably soon. But things are really going to need to change if this Chiefs offense wants to have a chance to compete for the AFC West title, especially with how well this Chargers team is playing. So, again, we'll see what happens. Monday Night Football tonight, Ravens versus Lions. Really excited about that. If you're in chat, let me know. What do you think? Who's going to win the game tonight between the Ravens and the Lions? Is Lamar Jackson going to be having an MVP caliber game? Does Jared Goff go off? Tell me what you guys think. Otherwise, I'm happy to let you go. This is the end of what I wanted to talk about, but if there's anything in chat you guys want me to talk about, definitely let me know. All right, if that seems to be it, I'll let everyone go. That's it for me today. Thank you again for watching Bad Takes in Football. I'm your host, Bad Takes, signing out.